Dr. Mary Dan Eades is a luminary in nutritional medicine. She was born in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and where she embarked on an illustrious journey into the world of health and nutrition, distinguishing herself as a pivotal voice in bariatric and nutritional medicine. Graduating magna cum laude from the University of Arkansas with a degree in biology and chemistry, she furthered her academic pursuits, completing her medical degree from the same esteemed institution. Alongside her husband, Dr. Eades, they delved into private practice, dedicating their time to clinical focus to bariatric and nutritional medicine. Their innovative approach to treatment, rooted in first-hand experience with over 600 patients, set a benchmark in addressing ailments such as diabetes, high blood pressure, and obesity. But beyond her clinical accolades, Dr. Eades co-authored 14 books, including the New York Times bestseller Protein Power. Her expertise shone brightly on television from 1997 to 2005, where she co-hosted infomercials and a 26-episode PBS cooking show, amplifying the virtues of a nutritional strategy she passionately believes in. Not only that, but she recently started delving into the world of romantic fiction, right? Writing the series Caddo Bend, which I am pretty obsessed with. And before we got on this interview, I was like, Mary Dan, when is the third book coming out? I am so desperate for it. So welcome to the show, Mary Dan. I am so happy to have you here.
I am delighted to be here and hope that that I have something to add to this conversation that people will find useful, helpful.
Absolutely. So, I mean, our talk is really titled The Evolution of Low Carb and Cognitive Dissonance, but it's so much more than that, right? You guys wrote Protein Power in 1995. It was, I think, 1995. Is that
we
correct?
wrote it in 95. It was published in the fall, in February of 96.
Okay, perfect. So, and Protein Power was a New York Times bestseller for how many weeks?
63 on the list. 63 weeks.
I mean, this is probably one of the books that was on the New York Times bestseller in that category for the longest amount of time.
Well, it's up there. It's up there. You know, Atkins has probably got that beat, but yeah, it's up there.
Right. But you know, I think what I'm trying to say here is you guys really are the first people who brought this concept of protein forward nutrition to the forefront. And you know, for a long time, and when I started coming into the scene only in like 2012, it was very much like low carb, high fat, right? But now we're seeing this turn back up to the focus being protein, with Gabrielle Lyon's book Forever Strong, and so many people are like saying, don't focus on, focus on protein, focus on muscle. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the evolution of the low carb diet. How can you talk to us a little bit about your experience of low carb diets and how it's changed and shaped over the past years?
Okay. We first got into it really in the 80s. And Mike did first. He wrote a book called Thin So Fast in 1989. It was published in 1989 by Warner Books. And it was about a protein-sparing modified fast, which was sort of the order of the day. Oprah had used OptiFast, which was a hospital-based program to lose a tremendous amount of weight. And then a clinical-based program had come out that was called MediFast, which was the same thing. It was protein shakes, pre-formulated, and that's all it was. We used it in our practice because it's actually a very good tool for people who, particularly people who are disordered about what they eat and have sort of issues with food, because it takes all the choices away. And for a little while, that's kind of good. It sort of lets them get their metabolic system back into sort of just the baseline, because they don't have choices. They just eat this, and some people are able to do that. So anyway, what we did was add a food meal to it so that it wouldn't be quite so low calorie, and we used it in our practice. But these clinical and hospital-based programs cost a tremendous amount of money, and a lot of people who were seriously overweight couldn't afford any of those programs. And so Mike got the idea to show people how to do it. We realized it was actually very safe to do, and they didn't need to be coming into the doctor once a week, which was what was required, or going to the hospital once a week, other than maybe for accountability. And so he had the idea to write a book about how to do it, and we developed that program and put it out there in 1989. So that was sort of the first foray into the protein sphere. And then together in 1995, we wrote the book Protein Power. Now, we didn't name it, actually. The publisher named it because it was a nice alliteration. I mean, we had 3 legal pages of brainstorms about what to name the thing, because it was originally called the Insulin Connection. That was what Mike had named it, was the Insulin Connection, because truly in Thin So Fast, that was the first time, certainly for the layman, that anybody had mentioned the word insulin as related to overweight and all these metabolic issues. It was in research circles, but it just had not ever been out into the lay literature until Thin So Fast. And he had a chapter there that was called the Insulin Connection. And then this whole book was going to be called the Insulin Connection and expand on it. And then the publisher didn't like that name. They said everybody will think it's about diabetes, and so they changed the name to Protein Power. And it really is a good name as it's worked out, because it is a diet focused on getting plenty of good quality protein as sort of the cornerstone of what makes all this work. You've got protein that's a nutrient, and then you have carb and fat that are basically fuels. And the one constant everybody has to have, and I don't care who they are, is they have to have enough protein to make things work. Without that, things kind of fall to pieces. So it really is protein power that makes the whole thing work. And if you choose to do it in a low carb form, with mostly the remainder of the calories being fat and not very much carb, then it becomes a low carb, really good protein, pretty high fat diet. But that's really what seems to work, and that's certainly what's been borne out over these last 4 decades.
Fascinating, the journey that you've been on and the length of time that you've been on it as well. And I mean, not to make you feel
Old.
like you are, you guys will refer to yourselves as like the low carb dinosaurs. And I by no means want to do this. I just want to draw attention to the fact that you have been practicing in this space for the longest period of time and really have the most phenomenal results. What do you believe the pivotal moments or key studies are that significantly impacted the popularity and acceptance of the low carb diet? Because that didn't happen until recently.
Well, that's really true. Although
recent meaning in the last 10 years.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I agree. It's really like from your perspective, one of those curves that kind of starts off slow and picks up steam, and then it really gets going. And certainly in the last few years, the keto space, particularly in the paleo space, have just gone crazy. I think I read a statistic that last year 23 million people claimed to be doing a keto diet. Now, maybe they weren't all, but 23 million people said they were doing a keto diet, and that space is going to be about a $5 billion market space this next year. So, or maybe even this year. So, from where we were, I mean, you had certainly we came in 1996, the year that Protein Power was published. There was also kind of a seminal paper that was published by Gerald Raven and Golay paper that was called Similar Weight Loss in a Low Carb and High Carb Diet. And it was interesting because that paper, the only thing similar in those two groups of people was the weight loss. Only, and at a year it was about the same, and it was both of these diets were 1,000-calorie diets, so it was a very low calorie in both instances, and that really matters because the higher the calories get, the more the composition of the calories begins to matter, and so you can lose about the same amount of weight on any diet if it's that low in calories. So weight loss notwithstanding, but it's interesting that they chose to name the title of the paper, Similar Weight Loss in Low Carb and High Carb, diets. Nothing else was similar. Triglycerides went down more, insulin improved more. I mean, every other parameter, blood pressure, glucose, everything got better significantly better on the low carb diet, but they didn't mention that except in the body of the paper. In the title, it looks like, oh, there's really no difference between these two diets. But that was kind of a seminal paper. And then we wrote the Protein Power Life Plan in 2000 to follow up Protein Power, and that really put a kind of a paleo evolutionary bent on the whole thing and took it back to its roots, because humans have been on a low carb diet for 3.5 million years, if you want to get down to it. Proto-humans were, before we were even us. It was basically a meat and fat diet with some carbs thrown in. So anyway, in 2002, I would say, an article appeared in the New York Times by Gary Taubes. That was the title of it was, what if it's all been a big fat lie? And basically sort of exonerating Atkins. I mean, when our book came out in 96, Atkins was kind of languishing in low-fat hell, I guess, for lack of a better word. And we, through the popularity of our book and all the advertising that our book got, it really resurrected Atkins. Because he's Kleenex. He's the name brand of low carb, and there's no doubt about it. It's the Atkins diet, even no matter who else's diet it is. So it resurrected his book sales and kind of put him back on the list. And Gary Taubes, being a scientific journalist, was looking into all this, and so he ended up sort of exonerating this whole concept of low carb as a person who had, I guess you would call it, no dog in the fight. He was, a journalist.
Yeah.
And I think that really got things moving, because then you have a couple of big studies, randomized controlled trials, because that was the big issue. People would say, well, if this is such a great diet, when we were on book tour, this is such a great diet, where are the studies that prove that this is the case? And you'll say, well, we're clinicians. We don't actually do studies. We need academic people need to come and do these studies. And there weren't that many. The Raven Golay study was one that, that we could talk about. But in 2003, there were 2 randomized controlled trials that compared low fat and low carb kind of head to head. One was a Foster study. The other one was a Samaha study. And the Samaha study, which was in AJCN, I think. No, New England Journal, actually used our diet as the diet that they used on the low carb arm. And it was, pretty conclusive that this was a better way to lose weight. It was a better way to control triglycerides, to control sugar, to control insulin, to solve these problems of insulin resistance and the metabolic syndrome. So those were those 2, and they were kind of well done big things. Since then, my gosh, the floodgates have opened. And, I think the Public Health Collaborative in the UK, the nonprofit in the UK, is now up to, I think, 67 studies that are head-to-head low carb to low fat for weight loss. It's hands down, I think, what's the number? 58 of the 67 show that the low carb diet is a better weight loss tool than the low fat diet. And only 7 show the low fat diet to be better, and none of those are statistically significant. So I don't think there's any doubt, just the preponderance of the data that's come since then. But I think you can track all of that back to the door got opened by Gary Taubes with that article in the New York Times.
Oh, I love that. Gary is also is one of the speakers at RevitalFest. So I'm excited to be asking him about that, because that is a question I do have for him, going through his own journey, right, of coming to this place where he's like, this is the way that we should be eating. I want to just briefly touch on this cognitive dissonance and your experience of it in the space. Could you unpack that for me, and your personal experience of it, and also seeing how others were affected by this?
Well, we certainly saw a lot of that when we first started using a low carb diet. At the time in the 80s, when we were using it in our practice, we were in a sea of low fat. I mean, the low fat mania had taken hold of the country. Everything was low fat. All of the medical recommendations were low fat, and we were truly sort of a crying in the wilderness people, saying, no, this is not right. We need to go a different way. And so you would see patients would come to us, for example, and we would whatever the problem was that was related to metabolism. Maybe they had high triglycerides, or maybe they were overweight, or they were borderline diabetic, or frankly diabetic, or the cholesterol was high, whatever. And we would put them on the diet, and they would go back to their family doctors, and the doctors would be happy with what they had accomplished. But when they told them how they accomplished it, they'd still want to put them on a statin, or they'd still, no, that you can't do, you need to do this. This is not right. And so they would see the evidence before their eyes, and yet they couldn't believe it because they're so indoctrinated. And that hasn't changed in a lot of quarters. It's changing for the better, thank God. But there's still people where they won't believe their own eyes, or their doctor won't believe his or her own eyes about really positive results. But I do think that's changing. And I don't know, I think it's just inculcated. It has been for so long that fat is the cause of heart disease, that saturated fat is the cause of heart disease, and that, okay, yeah, maybe you'll lose some weight on this low carb diet, but at what cost to your heart? You're gonna ruin your heart.
Yes.
And you can't do that. And but I think there are plenty of studies. Folic, I think, did one a few years ago that was maybe published in Lipids, that pretty conclusively showed that the more saturated fat people on a low carb diet ate versus people on a low fat diet who didn't eat much saturated fat, the more saturated fat they ate, the lower the saturated fat in their blood. And the less they ate, the higher the saturated fat in their blood. Because, carbohydrate, when it's turned to fat, and it can be pretty easily turned to fat, when it's turned to fat, it's turned to palmitic acid, which is a saturated fat. And so blood levels of saturated fat are worse if you try to keep your fat low than they are if you eat a good saturated fat diet. So even the American Heart Association has now given up the ghost, I think, about saturated fat being bad, being the cause. But it's going to take a while for that to bleed out into, to the minds of people who have invested a lot of time and energy in vilifying fat. And plus, you're up against a bazillion-dollar industry in pharma devoted to keeping people scared to death of fat and scared to death of their cholesterol, and taking damaging and expensive drugs just to get to a number that they like. My own brother, I have a strong family history for heart disease. This is part of my interest in all this, very strong. Our father had his first heart attack at 39 and died at 58 in end-stage heart failure. And, and my brother has got a stent. I was against that, but he got a stent, and, has had angina and problems like that. He's what is he now? 73-ish, maybe 73 or 4.
Yeah.
I can't remember. Sorry. Sorry, Larry, if you watch this. He just had a birthday. So he's 74.
Happy birthday, Larry.
But anyway, his doctor, he's right now in Spain walking another Camino. This is his 8th, maybe. He goes and walks the Caminos in Spain all the time with his granddaughter. And he's over there right now doing that, and is able to do it and not have heart pain, none of these problems. But his doctor is determined that he's got to get his LDL down to 70. And if his LDL is over 70, he needs to go on, one of these PCS, I can't remember how the letters go because I will never prescribe 9 drugs that cost $1 bazillion twice a week. And I keep telling my brother, for what? And he keeps saying, but this is what my cardiologist says. And I keep saying, yeah, but don't do it. And so there's even that cognitive dissonance within my own family of people who are strongly told one thing, and then, realize that somebody that they might actually trust is telling them something else.
Absolutely. And I think that's the most frustrating thing about cognitive dissonance, right? It's this immediate reaction to an opposing view without being willing to investigate it, right? It's just it's wrong, it's bad, I don't want to listen. This one said it's not. And it's well, please try and be open-minded. Let's find the research. and a lot of the people watching here are coaches and
Hmm.
athletes, right? And I think that they have this preconceived idea that they cannot perform if they don't have
Right.
carbs, because there is this misconception that carbs fuel
Right.
workouts, and that without carb loading, you're not going to be able to perform. Would you mind addressing
Oh, I'd
that?
be happy to.
This concept that we have to fuel with
With carbs. And
carbs and refined carbs.
you don't. You know, you do have to fuel with carbs unless you get adapted to fat. Because you'll totally run out of gas. You've got to become fat adapted first. And that takes a while. Steve Finney would tell you it probably takes 6 weeks to really get fat adapted. But once you get fat adapted, and your body's main fuel that you're going to run on is fat, you're not going to run on carbs. And the amount of body fat that a normal weight, a normal composed 150-pound person has on their body, they could walk from New York to Miami with that many calories. It's the body's biggest store of calories, the reservoir that you have to draw on. But you can't do it until you get into a fat burning pathway, which means you want to get fat adapted. And once you do, people, and Tim Noakes would be the first to say, people will run, these ultra marathons, these 100-mile marathons on no carbs at all, not refueling with anything along the way except water, and and do record times, because the human body, as it was developed from proto-humans 3.5 million years ago and up through, probably 60,000 or fewer years ago, when Homo sapiens was the last man standing, and modern human was what was left. The diet that organism was designed to eat through the forces of natural selection was a diet of fat and meat, of protein and fat, with very little carb. And it wasn't until the advent of agriculture, which was maybe, depending on part of the world, 5 to 10,000 years ago, really less if you're looking at the Plains Indians. That was only about 1,000 or 1,500 years ago. So some parts of the world have been at this agricultural thing longer and eating a diet that was richer in carbohydrate. But there were huge health consequences to that shift. We went from being robust with strong bones and sound teeth and big stature to all kinds of signs of nutritional deficiency in the bones and teeth that fell apart and shrunk stature on a diet that carb was the fuel source mainly and not fat. And so getting back to that gets us back to a diet that lets you do a prodigious amount of work, because it's what the biochemistry is designed for. And so, but you have to go to the effort of weaning yourself off of carbs as a fuel source and becoming fat adapted.
I think it's also important to just keep in mind that the diet we have should not just be based on trying to optimize our performance.
Hmm.
The diet we are on we should look at it as a long-term tool in the quality of life, our health span, our lifespan. And so being mindful that we're not just eating to fuel performance, but eating to fuel our bodies for a longer period of time. And
I'm
that the
not
low
sure this.
carb diet really is the best way to do that.
Right. And the whole thing is, I think once you do become fat adapted, your performance won't suffer. It does suffer at first. There's no doubt about it, because you're not adapted to using fat and the fat byproducts as fuels. But once you take the time to do that, then you're on a diet in sync with your natural biochemistry and biology, and you're in a diet that will be a good performance tool as well. I think there's plenty. I think Steve Finney has got plenty of information on that shows us that that's the case.
Perfect. Okay, my last question before we move on to something quite fun is, can you define what a low carb diet is in the way that we've
Okay.
been talking about it? Just very
Okay.
practically.
Well, it's really tough because it's a sort of a nebulous thing. Um, in our experience, you've got to get the carb content of the diet down. And I hate talking percentages,
Yeah.
because it makes no sense to me. uh, to talk with you. It's a 40-30-40, or it's a, it's
Yeah.
65% fat. Who cares? You need a certain amount of protein, and that's not a percentage, that's in grams. You
Yeah.
need a certain
Okay.
amount of protein for your body, and you start there. That's the cornerstone. And then around that, you do a fuel mix that keeps your metabolism working optimally. And that may be different if you're an ultra marathoner. You might stand more carbs than somebody else would
Yeah.
who is not as active, or if you're older or younger or more muscular or whatever. So what I would say is you set your amount of protein, however much that is for you, and you need to get enough to feed the lean body you have. However much that is, it's going to be different. If you're Sean Baker, than it is if you're Tinkerbell. I don't. It's going to be a different amount in absolute terms. But get that amount, and then choose a fuel mix that keeps your blood pressure in line, and keeps your blood sugar in line, and keeps your insulin in line, and just all of those things, whatever it takes. And I would say for most people, well, certainly for our patients, we recommended that everybody start at an amount when they're trying to make the switch over, an amount of carb that was no more than about 7 to 10 effective grams of carb. And that's the thing. Fiber's fiber, and it is a carb technically, but it doesn't really do anything to your insulin or blood sugar. So when we talk effective grams, we're talking about the kind of starch and sugar grams that would actually have an effect on your blood sugar or your insulin. So you get 7 to 10 effective grams per meal if you're doing 3 meals a day and maybe a snack. So let's say keeping it around 30 grams of effective carb a day. For most people, that's going to keep insulin down, keep blood sugar normal. Just for most people, that's going to work. You may be somebody that needs to go a little lower. You may be somebody that can take a little bit more. But I'd still say, 15% or less of your calories ought to be carb. That would be a good ballpark, I would say. Mostly it's going to be fat and protein.
Okay. And the protein requirement, the 1 gram per body weight per
I
kilogram of
do.
body weight.
We've always actually ourselves put it in terms of lean body mass and not total body weight.
Oh,
So
okay.
we've always said the part that you need to feed, the part that you're bringing in nutrients to build or replace or repair, is your lean body mass. So it's your muscles and bones and hair and skin and nails and brain and heart and whatever organs. It's that. So if you just feed your lean body mass, we like to say between a half and 1 gram of protein a day for your lean body mass pounds. So if you've got a 105-pound lean body mass, you need 105 grams of protein, or you could get by with less than that. But if you're really trying to build and you're working it hard, you want to kind of be at the top end of your range. So I'd say closer to 1 than to half. And if you're hurt, you're trying to heal an injury, you need more. If you're sick, you need more. If you're old, especially, you need more. And old is a relative term. I've been old. I've been old for a very long time on
Yes.
those terms, because anything over about 30, you start losing your lean body mass progressively unless you work it and feed it. And so from about 30 onward, you really need to stay at the top end of that range, like about a gram per pound of lean body mass, maybe even a little more.
I love that. Thank you so much. That was a beautiful description and a very measured one. And I think our audience will appreciate it a lot. Okay, let's move on to something super fun. Guys, we
Okay.
are shifting gears from nutrition to Mary Dan's latest fabulous two books that I've read. Can you tell us about it?
Well, I can. About back when we were first selling protein power, so I'll take it back to that. We were
Wow.
we were wandering down the street in New York with our agent, and I made the comment because I was right. I had written some other books for her on nutritional topics and health topics, but I said to her as we were walking down the street in New York, I said, you know what I'd really, really like to do? I'd like to write a romance. I'd like to write a romantic fiction. And so she said, oh, well, I think you should write something about a lady doctor in the rural South. And that's what she told me at the time. Kathy Hemming. Thank you, Kathy.
Oh,
And so anyway, I kind of shelved the idea. And then I went ahead and I actually wrote a real historical bodice ripper romance that I've never published that I just put in a drawer. And then during, that's about 2000, I guess, because I wrote a couple of chapters of this thing, or I kind of outlined a couple of chapters of something about a lady doctor in the rural South. And she says, write what you know. Well, I grew up in the not so rural South, but in the South of the United States. And I am a lady doctor, so there you go. So anyway, I just put that aside. And then in about 2000, my older sister, and she decided she wanted to take a screenwriting course. And there was one at the College of Santa Fe Screenwriter School, I think it was called. And so we took the screenwriting course, but we had to have a vehicle of some sort of story. And I said, well, I've got this thing about this lady doctor in the rural South that I've kind of got outlined. And she said, yeah, let's just do that. So we took this screenwriting course and we wrote it as a screenplay. And we registered it with WGA. And, actually, part of the screenwriting school is you get to present it to people. And we presented it to some people at Lionsgate and all these different people, and nobody bought it. But anyway, it was kind of fun to do. And it just languished in a drawer. And then during COVID, I guess searching for something else to do, I thought, you know what? The idea of that was for a novel, not a screenplay. And I think I'm more a novelist than a screenwriter. And I think I'm just going to drag that story back out. I'm going to turn it into a novel. And so I did. I fleshed it out into a novel, turned it into a novel, and then realized that there's a whole lot of that story. So then the second novel came out. So there's Cat of Bend, which is the series. And then the second novel in that series is Eye of the Storm, which takes the story of this Southern doctor, Maggie McKinley, who is a CrossFitter.
Yes, she is. She is.
She is a CrossFitter. She's an inveterate CrossFitter. She's a New York girl who comes to the rural South to pay off a rural practice loan that she's taken out for med school. And so that's why she's there. And it puts her kind of fish out of water. It's a different vibe there than Manhattan, in this teeny tiny town in Arkansas called Cat of Bend. And so anyway, the story is her time there. And so you get an insight into her practice, how she thinks about medicine, how she solves medical problems. You kind of, and there's a love triangle, of course, because it's a romance. And of course there has to be. And so anyway, that's the book. I'm working on number 3, which is about halfway through, and I hope will be out this winter.
Yep. And it is brilliant. I've loved every single one of them. I got into bed with number 1 and I didn't get out until I was done. And then the same thing happened with number 2. And then as Mary, Dan, and I got in the school, I was like, hey, when's number 3 going to be out? Because I really, really need a book to read. So I will link the link to Amazon below.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Mary, Dan, in finishing, is there anything else you want to say before we end?
I would say if there's one important thing that you should always remember, is that your muscle mass is your bank account for health and longevity. And you need to do everything you can to preserve it and defend it. That means feed it and work it.
That is literally the most powerful way to end this interview. Thank you so much for joining me and for the positive impact that you have and continue to have on my life. I'm really grateful.
No, thank you.